Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the Learning Playlist. And now, on to our show. Hello everyone, and welcome once again to another lecture on the contemporary world. In today's lecture, we are going to talk about global security. Now, looking at global security, perhaps one might be tempted to see not only conflicts, but to see perhaps to think about, rather than to think about conflicts in terms of state-to-state warfare, not conflict in terms of previous conflicts in the past century, like the Second World War, the First World War, the Vietnam War, etc., etc. However, when we look at conflict, we should take note that conflict is not simply between states, but rather conflict also involves people in general. Not only people organized in states, but people who are often more or not caught in such conflicts. Okay. Now, the world has seen a relative peace for quite some time. There has been no major incident, no great interstate war for at least for at least 75 years following the end of the Second World War, and that is considered as the most devastating war of mankind up to date. So what we are seeing now are localized conflicts. Some would even say, or some would call them as low intensity conflicts around the world. And here are some examples of those. The idea here is that conflicts now, though they are more localized, they are actually, you can say, they are actually, how do you say this? They actually are more complex and they now involve let's say new perspectives of understanding conflicts. So we are now no longer looking at conflicts as something between states, but we are now considering the human cost of conflicts. Okay? And this is critical for our discussion, and you need to remember this later on as we are going to talk about the transition from a focus on traditional security to human security. Talking about security, security has new forms nowadays. We are talking about security traditionally as safety of states against other states, which is the prime concern, especially by scholars coming from the Realist school of thought in international relations, wherein their prime claim is that anarchy is at the core of the world. No, anarchy defines international relations. Nowadays, we are going to, or rather, we now have understood that conflicts not only affect states, but they affect individuals and communities as well. So there's a transition now from safety of states against other states. We are now understanding conflict as safety of communities and individuals within states or among states, as we have seen horrendous atrocities committed, especially by states against their very own citizens. Let's say like what transpired in Rwanda back in 1994, and what has transpired also in 2015 until the present day with the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. Okay, so security now has transformed from protection from states or protection of states by others from other states to now protection, let's say, to protection of citizens or protection of individuals. Okay, so our understanding of security is more complex now, and it's not simply about armed conflicts, but the many and I would say the many devastating effects of conflict in traditional what do you call this in traditional iconography and thinking, no, because conflict has always been a part of the human existence. In traditional thinking, especially in Christian Europe during the 1600s, where many states actually suffered from, let's say, a precursor conflict called as the 30 Years War, uh, the problems of war and its many effects have been called as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Nowadays, we are no longer thinking of the four horsemen, but we are thinking of complexities in conflicts and its many effects upon human beings. So that's why the notion of human security was created to try to address this idea of um, or to try to address the complexity of numerous effects that war brings upon other human beings. Okay? So, for example, when we look at security, we are no longer simply thinking of security as between states, but how about conflict that occurs among different participant factions within states as well? So that's I think that's the more common type of conflict nowadays, rather than massive states like the United States and Russia going at it against one another in, let's say, in large areas around the world, no, large regions around the world. So the sources of insecurity now, of instability, which leads to conflict, is internal to the state. So this is the reality of conflict nowadays. Many of these conflicts are internal conflicts that have unfortunately spilled over into, let's say, other states. Case in point, the conflict in Syria, which is still ongoing today. So promoting security means addressing the weaknesses of states or governments and their failures to provide, for example, political and ethnic grievances to solve the numerous problems that they are facing, not only in terms of politics and identity, but also in terms of economic demands. No, so it basically we can say that states were not able to provide their citizens with with the needs that are, let's say, that are best described by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. No, so it's not simply the needs for representation that are not being addressed by states as well, but also the needs of, let's say, the physiological needs of people like food, water, medicine, etc. Okay, and demands for minority rights and freedoms, among others. So this is the idea here about security. Okay, and when we talk about security, there are threats that have emerged and are exacerbating many of the problems already present throughout the world nowadays among countries. Say, for example, global warming is creating a refugee crisis, and many of these refugees find themselves going to, let's say, more developed countries that can arguably support such massive influx of migrants, no, of immigrants fleeing from war, fleeing from lack of resources, etc., etc. Then there is also the problem of internally displaced persons, persons who are uprooted from their communities within their countries but are not really going elsewhere because perhaps their countries prevent them from traveling abroad. No? So that's the thing. There are people who are internally displaced. They can be internally displaced as well by natural causes like floods, storms, etc., etc. Then there are epidemics as well. I think we're very familiar with that by now, given that we are entering now the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic. So even if a state remains as the central provider of security, state-centered security, traditional security, is not sufficient to protect individuals from emerging threats and harms. Those threats and harms that were just mentioned earlier. Okay, so military security has its own problems as well. The idea of military security as a total means of security has always eluded um, policymakers and of course statesmen throughout time. So the idea of securing yourself through military security alone has failed time and again. No, you can ask the Romans, the Spartans, even the Egyptians at some point in their history. You can ask them about it if they are, well, if you have someone to talk to about them, especially in their histories. So you can look at it from an historical perspective that military security alone does not achieve the kind of stability required for a prosperous society, or rather for a prosperous world in general. So looking at security in terms of power, there are numerous traditional security arrangements around the world. We have multipolarity, which many are arguing is the focus right now, or rather is the reality right now of the world, wherein the United States is not simply the hegemon, but there are other challengers to its power now, like Russia, China, and many other countries. Okay? There was once a period of bipolarity during the Cold War wherein there are two superpowers. And then for a very brief period, starting around the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992 to, let's say, 9/11, no? To September 11, 9/11, the world enjoyed what is now known today as a unipolar moment, wherein the United States was largely unchallenged as the global leader in military, economic, and political affairs. So that was a very brief window in time. So from this idea of security, wherein of course states also have their security in terms of nuclear warfare or in terms of nuclear capabilities, um, there was also the notion of mutually assured destruction, which many argued was actually the main reason why the United States and the Soviet Union never came to blow. But that's a contentious claim at best. So take it with a grain of salt, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? So here are the nuclear bombs. They were used at the end of the Second World War by the United States. With still, this is still a dubious debate, or rather, not dubious, but this is still a contentious debate. So again, take it with another grain of salt whenever you're researching about this topic, whether the United States was justified in using two atomic bombs to actually make Japan surrender during the Second World War. Okay, so there's nuclear weapons as a means to stabilizing peace, but again, this is a double-edged sword and something that hopefully we will not have to walk through, or we will not have to go through again in our history. Okay, so enough of nuclear weapons. Let's go forward. Okay, so there's also conventional tactics or conventional weaponry of small arms, of ships, of fighters, etc., etc. Military technology at its finest. No, vanilla military technology to say the least. Okay, so shaping security is also very important. Shaping the notion of security is also very important. In states that are largely democratic and are interdependent upon other countries for their economic well-being, and also states that have a lot going for them, they would tend to invest in preserving the current status quo of the time rather than upset it and go to war. So, from a realist perspective, from the perspective of the two biggest schools of international relations, we can see that states are also their conception, their ideas of what is security for them is shaped by their outlook of the world, no, and by their connections with the world. So this has been well noted, especially in the time prior to the Second World War, wherein the the organization of the world at that time, no, the so-called League of Nations, they were actually not able to address many of the grievances and of course legitimate concerns of countries that want more resources for themselves. So case in point, Japan and Italy, that walk out of the international organization, the League of Nations, because they perceive that they are not secured in terms of resources for themselves, and that precipitated to the Second World War later on, when Germany followed suit in walking out of the League of Nations. So here's a concept of security. No, when states size each other up and they try to balance each other out. So rather than fight squarely, for example, fight the United States toe to toe, military to military, in conventional or symmetric warfare, some states deploy underhanded tactics per se, or let's say tactics that are not familiar to their adversaries around the world. They use asymmetric strategies of achieving security. Say, for example, Russia, which cannot challenge the United States in open battle. Russia has used, let's say, hacking, and some would even say election manipulation during the 2016 elections of the United States. No, so Russia may never have acknowledged it, um, may never have acknowledged its role in so-called election manipulation, but it also has remained vague enough in its statements that uh, it has somehow been construed by many that Russia did have a hand in such hacking incidents, and Russia is a known actor in the world that uses hacking a lot, no, especially um, in tactics of, let's say, online manipulation. So that's the thing with Russia. Okay. So here's some parts of asymmetric security threats. Okay, it's not necessarily that just some states using asymmetric forms of warfare like hacking it and many others, but also there are let's say threats that states and people have to navigate through around the world, no, or have to, let's say, deal with from time to time. Okay, so there's Yolanda, for example, which is largely about climate change, but climate change as a problem is also a security threat. It's it goes against the national interest. For example, for our country to go through, or to be, let's say, to be subjected to perhaps what is the most violent storm in recorded history so far. Okay. So the concept of human security is slowly becoming the center of attention for states now. Rather than just simply looking at interstate conflict, there are now threats that are, let's say, that are also as devastating and have become more frequent than conflict with other states. So we are now seeing the concept of human security take center stage around the world as a critical component of world politics today, and of course, um, political security, global security. Okay. So talking about human security, it focuses on two things. I mean, rather three things. One, it focuses on individuals or people as the object of security. Then it has many dimensions. It has multinational dimensions, and it's not simply economic, but also includes many other aspects. And it is universal in scope. It applies to all states and societies, whether developed or underdeveloped, no? Whether they be coming from the core states of Western Europe, for example, or they come from the global south. Okay. So, human security as we know it may have different aspects, but let's just say we take human security as a comprehensive approach towards moving, let's say, moving international relations and the study of it from understanding states as states going against one another towards an understanding that states cannot stand alone. There has to be, let's say, not only consensus building, but there has to be an implicit understanding that there are problems states cannot solve on their own, but rather that people need solidarity and understanding that that if they do not act together, if they do not coordinate with one another, these problems that they face, problems especially like climate change, may never be overcome if people are disunited over the idea that there are bigger problems than fighting or quarreling over, let's say, pieces of territory, for example. Okay. So this is the idea of human security as a whole. And I think you can glean the details of human security from the slides. So what I'm trying to say here as a parting or as a conclusion for this lecture is that human security as a notion is is something that is expected. It is something that has naturally evolved from our different needs as human beings in this world, and therefore human security is not simply just a concept that is supposed to be that is theoretical. This is a reality that we need to realize that states are no longer fighting one another that often, and therefore the problems of states is no longer simply conflict between one another, but trying to survive, trying to get by, let's say, trying to at least no trying to mitigate the problems that we have exacerbated in this world of ours, especially when it comes to our largely consumerist lifestyle. So many scientists are blaming human activity for climate change, the greatest threat to humankind right now, and of course the object as well of security. So yeah, that's the idea here. The idea that human beings are realizing that conflict among states is petty in comparison to greater threats that humanity faces today. All right, and with that, we will end our presentation, or rather, we will end our discussion for this lecture, for this segment of the course. Thank you once again, and I hope to catch you on the next one.